All right, well, it is 1 o'clock now, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our latest installment of the Educational Diagnosticians group learning cohort. I don't remember exactly what we called it, but I know we're really trying to build a good skill set out there. For any of you who might have joined this previously, we kind of did this session on the fly during one of our virtual office hours sessions where we had quite a few people attend and nobody really had anything to talk about. So we did this, but then we realized it really should be something that's offered out there for the rest of the group, the rest of the field to be able to have this information. So we've talked before about the process of identifying students for a specific learning disability using that insufficient progress model. And this is our other method of getting there, which is using pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So I'm going to jump into kind of what that is. Let me ask the 4 of you who are on here, did you attend the insufficient progress? If you could give me a hands up, maybe.
Oh, I didn't. I wasn't able to.
Okay, well, that's perfect. Then I won't feel like I'm going over a bunch of redundant information. So that's good.
I believe I did. I honestly can't remember. It's been so crazy. I'm pretty sure I did.
Well, here's kind of how we're going to approach this. We're going to talk about the context of identifying specific learning disabilities, meaning what is allowed by federal law, and then what Indiana is doing or has decided to do and how that kind of changed. And then we're going to look specifically into pattern of strengths and weaknesses and the different established methods that are out there for doing this. So we're going to look at the 3, I guess, main ways to go about establishing a pattern of strengths and weaknesses that have some backing to them. There are other methods out there, but these are the 3 strongest and 3 most used methods. So those are the ones that we're going to talk about. I know you guys have had this link to the Padlet over and over again, but just a reminder for in case we have anybody new, this is how you get to the Educational Diagnostician Padlet. This is where the handout is located if you weren't signed up early enough to have that sent to you yesterday. And it's also where you can easily find a link to this recording. Once it's done, it will be uploaded into the playlist in column 2 of the Padlet. So here's our context. When IDEA was revised the last time and kind of became IDEIA, the Improvements Act. And this was, I mean, my goodness, this is 15 years ago. It changed the way that we identified specific learning disabilities, or it at least gave us a little more guidance around that. Not in the specifics necessarily, but more in the general sense. It said specifically that we can't require use of discrepancy between IQ and achievement. Now, Indiana used to use severe discrepancy between IQ and achievement as their means of looking at a specific learning disability. So IDEA doesn't say you can't do it. It just says states can't require it, right? It can offer it. It also says that they have to permit at a state level the use of a process based on your response to scientifically based researched interventions. Now, what that really means is it has to allow us to use our MTSS, RTI data that we gather, but it says a process based on that, right? So if you don't know what that process is like, go back and view the other webinar on insufficient progress to get a better sense of kind of how that should look. So it's not just the fact that I spent a little time getting some intervention and collected some random data. It has to be specific. And then it also says it could permit the use of other methods for determining whether a child has a specific learning disability. Okay, so this was the federal guidance on this. And looking across the country, you've got a lot of differences, right? So you have less than half of the states that are allowing some kind of alternate method. And in this case, pattern of strengths and weaknesses is the alternate research-based method, the third option. You have most states who still allow discrepancy, right? A little crazy. And then you've got a pretty small number requiring those RTI kinds of data. But you know from the national guidance that we all have to be allowed to do that. It's just that we have 13 of the states that say you have to do that. That has to be part of it. So here's what we did in Indiana. You know, we have to sometimes be a little difficult when we go to write our own regulations. We said, forget discrepancy. We are done with discrepancy. It did say that we permit the RTI or insufficient progress kind of model. And we also decided that we could have that third option, another method, and that is what we're doing as pattern of strengths and weaknesses. Okay, so in order to say that somebody has a specific learning disability, we are only left with B and C. We are either using insufficient progress model or we are using pattern of strengths and weaknesses, and those are our only options in Indiana. So this is chunking this out of Article 7, some of the language. It's not all word for word, but it basically says, you know, a learning disability, we've got a kid who doesn't achieve at an adequate rate or to an adequate level for their age or to meet the standards for that grade level in one or more of the areas. And I think we all know what those areas are of specific learning disability. Now, the caveat here is when provided with learning experiences and instruction appropriate for their age or those grade level standards. And that's a big piece of it right there, is that they have to have good instruction. If they don't have those learning experiences and they're struggling, we don't know that it's a learning disability. We know they're struggling. I mean, that's not in question, but the why may have to do with not getting the exposure that they need. So we know lack of instruction is one of those things that we have to pay attention to.
But Angela, that's one of the most difficult to describe or to share with the building level administrator or the classroom teacher.
Absolutely. And I think that is a huge issue right now with all the gaps in instruction for the students who learning was interrupted because of COVID. I mean, I know that's not something we can solve in a short period of time of figuring out how in the world do we parcel out what might be disability versus what might be COVID related instruction, you know? So again, it says it's evidence through one of the two methods. And then we have to have all of those things that we factor out, that we say, you know what, these things all could play a part in what's going on. But what it says is, as far as exclusionary factors, that one of these things that's on this list can't be the primary reason that the kid is struggling, right? I could still have some visual problems and have a learning disability. You know, I could have some things going on in my environment that are disadvantaging my learning and my situation, but I could also have a learning disability. it has to do with it being the primary result of one of these things that would rule out a specific learning disability. So lots of things that we have to take care of, which makes our evaluations so long and so much fun, right? So we've got some inclusionary criteria. We also have the exclusionary criteria. And then there is always a general criteria for eligibility that every single disability area has. And we have to hit all 5. It can't be 4 out of 5. It has to be everything in order to be eligible for specific learning disability. So what we do have to have is we have to have evidence of underachievement of some kind. So there has to be something going on, either age or grade level standards. And then we have to have one of those indicators of a specific learning disability. So either pattern of strengths and weaknesses or the insufficient progress model. And then we've got to factor out the other pieces, which are all those exclusionary factors. And then we also finally have to show that there is adverse effect on academic or functional performance. And those pieces we take care of through all of the things that we do, all the data that we collect, the way that we fill out our reports, the way that we use, if you're using that SLD checklist within the system, that can help make sure that you've covered all those things as well. Again, I know you all know what specific learning disability is. What I want to point out here is when you figure out which method that you're going to use or which indicator for specific learning disability, there is nothing that says within the state law that a district or a school or a psychologist has to pick one and stick with it. Right? It can be made on the individual student level because you may have kids on your caseload that are coming from a school that is doing a fabulous job with interventions and collecting data, and you think that you can gather enough data using insufficient progress to establish that. And then you have a kid who's a 9th grader in a school who's not doing any intervention work, and you know that data is not there, and your option is to look at pattern of strengths and weaknesses. I mean, you can make that decision, but you should make the decision prior to starting the eval. You shouldn't be going into an evaluation, collect a bunch of data and say, let's see what filters out and which one I can make a case for, because insufficient progress, you're looking at 20-day evals. Pattern of strengths and weaknesses, those are 50-day evals. If you follow all the other criteria for determining timeline. But in general, that would be the case. All right, I'm going to skip this piece here. Okay, and we're going to jump into the methods. Okay, so we have 3 different kind of basis for how pattern of strengths and weaknesses is determined. One is discrepancy consistency, one is concordance discordance, and then the other that I think most people are more familiar with is CHC based, which tends to be used through using a cross battery kind of approach. But it's very much based on CHC theory, which the second one is as well. They just approach it very differently as to how they establish whether something truly is a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So we're going to go over all 3 of them. So we're going to start with discrepancy consistency. And my bias is when I use pattern of strengths and weaknesses, this is what I tend to use anymore, just because I'm really connected with the results I get from the cognitive assessment system. So it's not that I want to endorse that test necessarily, but it fit me well for the kids that I was working with when I was still testing. And I found that I got a lot of good information out of it. So it's used with the cognitive assessment system because it's based on the components that test collects data on. planning, attention, sequential processing, and simultaneous processing. So here's how it works. It's looking specifically at consistency and variability within a cognitive profile of those different pieces, your planning, attention, sequential, and simultaneous processes. And it's looking at some your academic scores and seeing the consistency and the differences within those as well. So in order to show a pattern that would make sense as being a pattern of strength and weakness, it's looking for some differences among your cognitive processing scores, some differences in your achievement scores, but some consistent scores between your low areas in academic and achievement, and making sure that low really does mean low, right? 90 is not low in any way, shape, or form. It may be a relative weakness for somebody, but it is not a substantially low score. It is not below average. 86 is really not below average, right? And sometimes we have a hard time explaining that to people when I had a real strength in something else that was like a 115. Well, we all have strengths and weaknesses. And just having strengths and weaknesses does not create a learning disability. And I think sometimes we hear pattern of strengths and weaknesses and think, well, I've got one of those. Well, I have one of those too, but that's not what we're looking at here. It's systematically looking at those differences and those commonalities. So you might think, okay, I've got to have something out of my 4 scores be out of whack, right? Something needs to be lower. And sometimes it's 2 scores that are lower than everything else. But then when I look at my academics, I'm going to have something that is lower as well. And those 2 low scores should make sense, right? So if I have a low score in sequential processing, and I'm having a lot of trouble with reading words, and you can see from what you're doing with me academically that my low score there, that I'm having trouble getting all my sounds kind of lined up in a sequential fashion, and that makes sense to me, right? That's kind of logically like, well, of course I would have difficulty with that. But sometimes we see patterns that are there, but the patterns don't make sense. And we may need to dig in and get some more information in order to figure out, what really does that mean? What meaning does it have? Because it's not just about a score getting you in the door. It's about your score making sense for what do we do, right? How does this tell me more about how you learn? So you can see this just a little bit bigger, that we should have those significant differences between your processing strengths and your processing weaknesses. Also, significant differences between your processing or your achievement strengths and your achievement weaknesses, but also some similarity between your area of weakness in each of those things. And when I say significant, it will tell you in your essentials manuals. So if anybody is using this method, I would highly encourage you to pick up the essentials in, I think it's essentials in using the CAS. I think that's what it's called. But it walks you through and it gives you charts to tell you this number is significant, this one isn't, right? It tells you whether something is valid or not. So you look at your achievement scores. It has you go through and take your different past scores and compute an average and then you look at the difference between those two scores. So this kind of walks you through a little bit more. You know, in this case, and I think this is very similar to how we think about it for any of the tests that we're doing, we start with some achievement testing. And sometimes that doesn't happen, right? Especially if you're working with somebody else and they're responsible for a piece and you could get in and do something first. A lot of times we go in there and do it. But it makes sense if we can get the achievement testing done first, because if we test achievement for a specific learning disability and there is no deficit, there is no reason to go on and do more testing, right? I mean, if I test all academic areas of concern and everything is 100, then I'm certainly not going to go out and give an IQ test. It doesn't make any sense to do that. So you can see that this points you to, if it's no, yeah, let's figure out what's going on with this kid that might cause some problems, but it's not a learning disability. So computing that average pass score, and then you're looking for, are the processing scores below 90, right? Is there anything that's below 90? And then you're looking for that difference between each of those scores and that average pass score. And again, the manual kind of walks you through this, but this is the simplest method that I have seen as far as steps in the book. And then you're going to look for those different discrepancies and consistencies. And that points you in the right direction. It gives you lots of charts in the book too, as to different combinations that are typically found with students of specific learning disabilities in different areas. So I found the book to be really helpful in kind of guiding you to patterns that make sense, that you feel like you could write in your report that this is the pattern we saw and this is what it means, to make it meaningful. Okay, like I said, it's not that I'm married to that one, but I do feel like in general, it is probably the easiest one out there. Oh, I'm just seeing Amanda's. Oh, awesome. Okay, so if you look in the chat, there is a calculator that you can get, and I believe it is free on his, I think it's on his website, that will just calculate that out. And so it will clearly tell you, yeah, that's not significant. And I think that's something that you can rely on in your reports too, to come back and say, yes, these were the numbers, but these were not significant differences based on an established method of calculating whether something's significant or not. All right, the concordance discordance model, again, it's kind of, it's based on CHC theory of looking at all of those different cognitive processes, but it's pretty darn complex. If you like to do a lot of math, this is your method of choice. But it's got some very similar thinking behind it. It's just using different scores and processes. So again, similar criteria. It's looking at some similarity or concordance between those deficit areas in both academic and cognitive. And then it's also looking for differences between your academic deficits and your cognitive strengths. So that's a little bit different than how PASS looks at that first method. And then differences between your cognitive deficits and your cognitive strengths, which that it did use that, right? So there's some overlap here, but a little bit of difference, because it is looking at a significant difference between the area that you're struggling in academically and your cognitive strength. To me, this falls back a little bit on the old severe discrepancy model, which makes me a little bit more uncomfortable with that. I mean, I understand the thinking, but it's kind of pushing the edge to me of severe discrepancy. Okay, so again, you got to have a processing strength. The IQ processing piece has to have a strength, and you got to show a deficit. So I think oftentimes we're still seeing people fall back on the original severe discrepancy method, but they're just calling it pattern of strengths and weaknesses. So what I see is, well, you've got highs and lows because I've got high cognitive skills, but I have a low academic area. And that's, again, that's not what pattern of strengths and weaknesses means. It's looking at your cognitive profile, and you're going to have some strengths and weaknesses there. And the same thing within your achievement areas as well. So in this case, you got to have a difference between your cognitive processing strength and deficit area. And you also have to have a significant difference between your cognitive processing strength and your academic area that you're struggling with. And then you shouldn't have much of a difference between your processing deficit and your achievement deficit. All right, so here are a bunch of steps, right? You got to score everything up. You got to look at your cognitive score and figure out, is it good, right? Which we do anyway. Anytime that we give an IQ test, we kind of look at it and think, man, is the overall what we're looking at? You know, are the subtest scores okay? What do we have to do as far as interpretation of the cognitive? So it gives you kind of some step-by-step pieces of whether or not to use the information, or whether you have to figure out a new factor, or add some other information in to be able to create a score that's usable. So what you're hoping for, if you're looking for a specific learning disability, is that you're going to have good, solid information, but you can see the highs and lows within the different areas of the test. And it's consistent enough within the subtests in that factor that you feel confident saying, okay, I think this is a good score. So if you can interpret that, then you move on and look at the achievement pieces. Otherwise, you're going to have to do some other stuff to gather more cognitive information. So when you have achievement scores that show that you've got some sort of academic deficit, and we're looking at, is that good, consistent information based on what's being shared from the classroom teacher, you know, what's happening on, you know, what other assessments are showing you, right? Because sometimes we hear, oh my gosh, reading is terrible. Reading is the area of concern. We test, reading comes out in the average range, and we find a big deficit in math because we just happen to test in math too. And we think, okay, but there was no concern about math. It didn't make any sense. It's not consistent with what was being reported in the classroom performance. All right, so then we think about, are the cognitive deficit areas that we found likely to impact that achievement area? And just, again, you're thinking logically here about what would make sense. If I'm struggling with this, how could it possibly affect this area? And if you think, I don't think that there's a connection there, then it's likely that you're not going to find a learning disability. If it makes sense, then you would move on to the next step. Then you got to dig into the manuals of the tests, right? That's the hard part. You got to see if the reliability coefficients are listed in the manuals. And these are not the administration manuals, but typically the technical manuals that come along that we never even crack into, right? A lot of them may still have the cellophane on them because we just assume most of the time that when we get tests, they've got good information in them and we're never going to have to look at this stuff. But here you would have to look at it. You have to pull out those coefficients and you have to put them in this lovely formula, right? To calculate the standard error of difference. This is basically kind of, if you're using the past score analyzer for the other method, it's doing this kind of stuff. It knows what would come out as significant and what would not. This makes you calculate it based on the test that you use, because this is not assuming that you use any particular test, if that makes sense, right? The PASS is assuming that you use the cognitive assessment system, and therefore it knows all of this stuff and can calculate it for you. So you're going to look at the cognitive strength and a deficit area, calculate all this stuff out with, math that I don't remember how to do. And then if the difference is greater than, the difference between the two is greater than the SED critical value, then you've got something there, right? Now you're going to have to repeat those steps anytime you're looking at a different area. So for any of you who are currently using cross battery, you'll know that you could look at multiple areas that you're trying to establish some sort of pattern of strengths and weakness. You would do the same thing here. If you have other strength, weakness areas that you want to calculate, you just have to run them through the same formula in order to calculate all this out. So the same thing with the cognitive strength and academic deficit. You're going to go through this all the time to make those calculations. More calculations. Are you turned off by this one yet? Because it really is, it's difficult. And you're going back to say, okay, now I really have to look at the literature. I have to look at all the information I have. I have to figure out whether or not this truly represents a pattern of strengths and weakness. Because it's so, I guess, undefined in Article 7 that it is basically relying on us to use a good research-based method for establishing this. And it's telling us not just to find a pattern of strengths and weakness, but to find a pattern of strengths and weakness that, based on what is in the literature, represents a specific learning disability. It doesn't tell us what that is. Now, these methods help to point out, yes, this is real, and boy, that one just doesn't seem to have any basis to it. So I personally do not know anyone who has ever used that method. It is out there. It is out there for anyone to use. But I don't know anyone who specifically is using it. It gets some press, I guess, and has had some research. So the third method is, I would say, more used in Indiana than the other two. And that is using the CHC-based operational definition, which most people refer to as cross battery. And the concept of cross battery really has to do with the fact that we're going to use the theory of all of the different processing areas of cognitive abilities. And if we have to use more than one test battery to measure all the things we need to measure, then that's what we do. And it's kind of a specific step-by-step process for figuring out what do we need to test, what do we need to look at. but it is not necessarily cross battery. It's just that this is when people use cross battery, most of the time they're talking about using this operational definition. So again, we're looking for low achievement in something specific. Remember, the term is specific learning disability, not general learning disability. And then we look for a cognitive deficit that in the research makes sense to be linked up with a specific academic area of weakness. Now, this kind of throws a little bit of a wrench in it for people who use this, because it also wants us to determine that most of a student's cognitive abilities are average to above average. Now, there's a little bit of kind of factoring out the area of weakness, because I could be stellar in all of my cognitive processing skills and have a super significant area of weakness that might bring the other areas down. Like, if that's when we look at a full scale score for a kid and go, whoa, that doesn't make any sense. But it basically says you should have an otherwise normal profile. So when you pull out the piece that we're thinking is part of the learning disability, then everything else should be pretty much average or even above average. Now, this kind of leaves out a lot of our kids who we would think of in the slow learner range, our kids that maybe have a 75 IQ, right? That don't fit an intellectual disability, and they really don't fit a specific learning disability, but they're struggling probably more than our students who get identified as specific learning disability. So it can be a struggle, and it also can be a very hard sell when you are truly using this particular method and you have to stick with that. Then it can be a hard sell to parents and teachers who say, wait a minute, why can't my kid get help? Well, because they really don't fit a pattern of strengths and weakness based on this definition that would indicate a learning disability. All right, so we're going to look at kind of what's behind that use of cross-battery assessment, which is the theory, and then the different classifications of abilities, and then we're going to take it through how this gets calculated. So it really is just a way to understand different cognitive processes and look at overall intelligence. And most of the tests that we get nowadays, not all of them, but most of them are linked to or based on the Cattell-Horn-Carroll theory of cognitive processes. So within the theory, there are all these different broad classifications. And I'm sorry if this is a repeat of some of your grad school classes to some of you. We're not going to get too far into the weeds on this. But we have all these areas of G, right? If G is kind of thought of as your intelligence, then it has these different G broad classifications of different kinds of skills and how different things are grouped. As different subtests of our IQ tests were formed, it was all based on factor analysis studies and different task analyses of how we do different things, and connecting it back to specific constructs so that, again, subtests are kind of clustered around what do they measure? What are we looking at? So I'm not going to explain what a lot of these are because, again, you guys are probably using this stuff in your reports already. But the different G areas that we look at just represent different pieces and parts of how we think, right? How we process information, how we solve problems. And most of these are things that we're going to see on typical IQ tests, right? Typical cognitive tests. They tend to measure them slightly differently. Then there are a couple that are kind of separated out as, these are related to your cognitive processing, but there's also a lot of overlap with what happens within your academic achievement, right? So the last three, quantitative knowledge, that would be math, right? It's how you work with numbers, how you work with quantitative concepts. Reading and writing, clearly tons of overlap with academics. And so what we're not looking at is things like, wow, I have a lot of problem with my quantitative knowledge in the processing piece, and I have a lot of problems with math, because those are the same thing. So we're not looking for those connections between an IQ test and an achievement test. It's really the other processes that get calculated in. And then each of those areas has more narrow classifications. So we're looking at a lot of different kinds of tasks, which means I could have an IQ test that gives me a very good indication of general sequential reasoning and nothing on induction. And then I may have another test that gives me a little bit more information on quantitative reasoning and induction, but nothing on general sequential reasoning. So it's important for us to look at what kind of tasks were on the test that we gave when it comes time to look at our highs and lows. So if I have a test that maybe I've given a couple of different subtests and they're measuring very different things, I might expect to see some differences. And now I've got to figure out what's going on and how does that make sense. So each of these different G factors, GF, GC, all of these different things that were part of the broad classifications, they each have multiple narrow classifications, and different subtests of different tests are categorized as to what it is that they're measuring. Some of them not so purely. Sometimes they're measuring a couple of things, but within the different tests and within using the cross battery program, the actual disc that you can get to help analyze that, it knows which test measures what. Okay, so I'm going to just skip through those because, again, we're not going to go over all of these since this isn't training on cross battery. But you can see there's a ton of stuff we could potentially be testing. We don't test every narrow ability that a student has. If we did, they would hate us. They would miss way too much instructional time. And I think we would just have an overload of information, and we would probably end up finding problems that really didn't exist by the end of all of our testing. Okay, so this is how cross battery and this approach looks at what we do. So first it says, pick your IQ test carefully. Think about what the concerns are that came to you in the first place, and don't just pick the test because this is the test I always use. Think about what kinds of things that you want to measure. You're going to specifically use any cluster scores that you can get from the test when you can. Sometimes you can't, or sometimes you get a cluster score that says, the kids' highs and lows within this cluster are so spread out that you can't use this. You can't use this cluster score. And then making sure that you're using good tests and you're selecting different tests and subtests because they seem appropriate for the question again. So it's looking at the referral concerns, and it's also making sure that you're using tests that are good quality, valid and reliable tests. So sometimes you get those broad areas that aren't measured very well. Maybe the IQ test that you started with is only giving you one little snapshot of this, or some of our IQ tests don't measure a particular broad area at all. So you really don't have a good score for that. And that's where the cross battery piece comes in. It says, I may have to dig into another test that will help give me a better sense of this broad area, or replace it as a whole because this test didn't have anything. So a lot of people who use cross battery are using the Woodcock-Johnson. I don't like the Woodcock-Johnson, but I will say that the Woodcock-Johnson basically covers everything. If you use the Woodcock-Johnson, you usually don't have to supplement much unless you get a rogue score that you're like, ooh, I need to look into this using something else. So it guides you to when you do use another test to supplement. So when crossing batteries, you want to use things that are developed and normed within a few years of each other. And you don't want to have, I'm going to use 2 subtests from this test and 2 subtests from this test, and then I'm going to use part of this test. You want to keep it as minimal as possible. So think about, what does your main battery cover? And was this the right battery? And if so, where are the gaps? And what tests could I use that would really fill those gaps? So, I wouldn't jump beyond, 2 or 3 different pieces and parts to supplement. All right, so I like their process for this. And the main thing that I really like is they keep pushing you back to thinking about exclusionary factors. So this, again, very much like the very first method, says start with the academic achievement, right? Because if the academic achievement doesn't show anything, then that pretty much stops the cross-battery approach. It may not stop what you're doing as a whole for the evaluation, because you still have questions to answer. Obviously the student must have been struggling somehow. But if on paper, on tests, they've got the skill set and they can do that for you, it's not likely a learning disability, it's something else. Either way, whether you find deficits or not, it wants us to then take a look before we go any further and think about those exclusionary factors. Is there a lack of instruction? Is English not the native language of the student? Are there visual problems? Are there hearing problems? What's going on? Just thinking about all of those different exclusionary factors, because we either need to address some of those things and then backtrack, or we maybe should stop right there. Because again, there is no reason to go on and do a cognitive assessment on a student where we know no matter what the outcome of that assessment, it's not because of a learning disability, it's because of something else. All right, then at that point, we go in and assess cognitive abilities, and we take a look at those. And then we look again and think about exclusionary factors, right? So it wants us to push that thinking of the exclusionary factors in multiple times. It's not a one-shot deal. It's every time we get new information, we're thinking about, what does that mean? And are there other things that could be a factor? And then it goes into the analysis of the information, which we'll talk about what that looks like. And then finally, does it interfere with functioning, right? So that last criteria for any disability is, does it adversely affect a student's academic and/or functional performance? So this just very deliberately says, yeah, you can have this pattern, but if it's not getting in your way in any way, then really you don't qualify as a student with a specific learning disability, which, I mean, we know However, sometimes we get really locked into results. What do the numbers say? What does that mean? But we have to have that last piece in there. Okay, so this takes you through all of these different steps. Now, I'm going to say from somebody who has used this method and used the XBAS software that it really pushes hard for people to test anything and everything that they can. Like you feel like you need to put something in every box that you can. But what the law says is that when we're looking at a possible disability, that we're gathering information related to the areas that we're concerned about and anything that might be related to determining eligibility or figuring out what to do for a student. So this is consistent with that in thinking that, okay, what do I need to look at? What needs to be assessed? And I think we're always locked into, well, I've got to look at reading, writing, math, oral expression, and listening comprehension. Well, not necessarily, because if everything I know about this kid's math, from iLearn, from classroom performance, from NWEA, from anything you've got, says it's fine, I don't necessarily need to do a Woodcock-Johnson on the math, right? Or do KTEA subtest scores for math. Think about what do we need to assess. Sometimes it's easier to just assess everything, but it makes more sense to me to deeply assess the things that we're concerned about and use established information that says a student is okay in other areas. This also says, you know, you should really measure a student's achievement in any of those areas, but then anything that does come up low, yeah, give it a second measure. Indiana really doesn't say that. There are some states that specifically call for you to give a second measure of any low score that you get. I know some of your school districts probably have that as a local procedure. And again, follow any local procedures that have been set for you. But there is nothing in Indiana law that says you need two measures. What it does say is we don't rely on a single score. So again, if I get a KTA decoding score that comes up at a 62, and I go to the teacher and say, oh my gosh, I see there's decoding problems. And the teacher says, wait, what? Dibble shows that this kid is fine in decoding, right? Well, now I've got conflicting information and I have to figure out what to do with that. So anytime that we have something that comes up with a low score, we're comparing that to classroom performance. We're comparing that to district data, to state data, anything that we've got. And we're not just relying on the score. But again, they say administer one. If it comes up low, you're going to give a second in that area. And then make sure that you can use, you can have some sort of a cluster score, right, for that domain. Make sure that it's consistent and figure out whether it is a normative deficit, right? So most of the time, we're thinking at least below 85. Now, some of you within your district may say, you know what, it needs to be below 80 for us to consider that a normative deficit. We just know it has to be below average, right? So how you do that locally may vary. Okay, we're looking at those exclusionary factors. You know what all of those are. And then it would make sense to go on if we figure that what we're seeing so far is not primarily due to any of the exclusionary factors. Then we look at the cognitive. Now, it wants us to look at whatever battery that we use, that it's giving at least 2 measures in each of those broader areas. Sometimes our tests don't. Sometimes we have tests that only give, really one subtest in a particular area and is not adequately measuring each of those broad G abilities. So that's where we might have to supplement from another battery. And again, we're looking at it kind of forces you within the program itself to say, okay, if I've got 2 scores and they're similar enough to where I can use the cluster score that the test gives me, then it accepts that. If they're too different, it's going to tell you, you need to give another subtest from another test and factor that in, and it will figure that for you within the system. You're not going to have to do specific calculating as long as you're using the XPath system. Then you have to figure out whether there is a normative weakness. And again, the system does all this for you. And it should be at least one of the areas. Now, if you're getting half of your areas coming up as a weakness, you're not going to end up with an otherwise normal profile anyway. That is just a kid with a lot of strengths and a lot of weaknesses, but not representative of a specific learning disability. Ooh, my font went a little crazy here. So again, you're going to re-examine all those exclusionary factors. And again, if you say, you know what, these things, I don't think that they are the primary reason for why this student is struggling, then we keep going in the evaluation process. So now, if we've got a significant difficulty in academics and we have a significant difficulty in cognitive deficit, then we're looking for patterns. We're looking for explainability, right? There has to be something that makes sense, just like any of the methods. The connection between my 2 weak areas, cognitive and academic, should make sense. And I honestly, I think you can make a case for a lot of things, but you're also looking for the empirical data that says, we've got studies that show that these 2 things can affect each other significantly. So that's what you're going to be looking for. You can use the essentials book, you can use the program. It will point you to what makes sense. And then again, we're looking for evaluation of that interference. So the adverse effect on educational performance. So how is it getting in your way, right? Are they a lot of deficits? Is it something specific? What's going on? And it's asking a lot of the same basic questions. Do you have an otherwise normal profile? Are there things that might be affecting you that are outside of a learning disability? So how many of you have the XPath system? I'm not seeing any hands pop up or anything. It's a kind of a cool program to use because you just start chunking in all your scores and it guides you through the process as far as, ooh, yeah, you're going to have to dip into something else because these scores are too different. Or it will remind you that your test didn't even cover this area and you're going to have to get some kind of measure of this broad area in order for us to even calculate kind of your overall profile. It also will tell you whether or not those scores are different enough to be significant. or similar enough to be significant. All of the things that you're looking for so that you don't have to personally say, well, let's see, and he has an 84 in this and a 98 in this. I don't know, right? When you hear scores like that, I mean, if you told me this student has, solid IQ, but they have this weakness that is an 84 in processing speed, and they have math fluency scores that are at another level, I can see where math fluency and processing speed make sense, right? I'm not going to be fluent at something if I'm not good at speed on a task. But to know whether or not that those scores connect well enough to say, yeah, that score is low enough to have the impact on this area. How low is low enough? And that's something that the program just helps you to figure out. It gives you a nice graphic. I've used the graphics before and copy pasted things into a report. I will give the caveat that it was outside of the IEP system because copy pasting isn't always happy in there. But I've used that as handouts to be able to show parents, to show teachers, to say, here's where we kind of had good information, but over here, it just doesn't look like it's a learning disability. Or to make a good case for why something is a learning disability, showing that I'm using something real, I'm using something research-based. And here's something to show you that it's not just me and my opinion about whether a student qualifies. And I feel like we're left in that position a lot of going into a conference and just having everyone say, well, do you think they qualify? This gives us a little bit more to kind of hang our hat on to say, well, the numbers line up and here's why it makes sense, or here's why it doesn't make sense. All right, so just a comparison of the different models. They kind of work on a little bit different stuff, I guess, and use, you can see there's a lot of overlap here, right? I mean, obviously you have to have an academic weakness. If you didn't, it wouldn't be a specific learning disability. All three methods expect that there's going to be some kind of a cognitive weakness. So if your IQ is 100 across the board, or 90 to 105, but you really don't have any scatter that indicates that you've got a specific processing weakness, then it is not specific learning disability by definition, right? And then we've got to have a logical and empirical connection between those two different areas of weakness. They all also think, you've got to have some cognitive strengths there too. They all can't be low areas, meaning they're all pretty much assuming that you should have average to above average IQ. Now, you only really have to have a global cognitive score when you're using consistency discrepancy. And part of that is because they're using that average pass score overall. They're using an overall kind of conglomerate of your 4 different areas in order to compute how low is low within the cognitive areas. So it's not that you are necessarily having to report an overall IQ score, but you're getting an average of the different past processing areas. All right, so that gives you some discrepancy or different scores, but not discrepancy in the same sense of severe discrepancy between overall IQ and achievement deficits. And really, the only one that has to have a specific test is the first model, because it's set up to use the CAS. All right, now that I've said all of that, I would highly encourage you to look up this particular journal article. There's a lot of difference of opinion out there within the field of school psychology specifically about, really, is there good evidence for pattern of strengths and weaknesses? And it's, I mean, this is the best we've got. These three methods, I think, give us some good information, but there's also a lot out there that says, you know what, this stuff really isn't all that helpful in identifying what to do for kids. I would think the authors of some of the tests that are kind of pulled into using the cognitive piece would argue it, and they do argue it frequently within the field. But there's been some kind of negative studies out there that say, I just don't know about all of this IQ cognitive processing information and how valuable it really is. So, I don't want to make up your mind for you, because honestly, in Indiana, we have so many schools that are struggling with the intervention process and collecting good enough data to allow us to feel comfortable using the insufficient progress method for LD identification, that we're kind of left doing this. When we can't do it right one way, we have to do it some way, right? We have to evaluate students, and this is the best that we've got. So, I mean, you have to make up your own mind about what you're going to do in your particular situation. But I just thought this is a short article, but it's pretty good about kind of laying out this battle that's out there. So you can look that up on your own. So we've got some time left, because I figure we probably would have quite a few questions or war stories. The session is being recorded, so I would just ask if you want to share anything, that you don't share any confidential information that would be identifiable about a particular student. But tell me what your experiences have been so far with pattern of strengths and weaknesses. I know this is not a shy group either.
So I have a question. Have you seen any research that is kind of stating that maybe we should go to a pattern of strengths and weaknesses model because of COVID? With the interventions last year, with last year being kind of a crazy school year for everybody, have you seen anything about that? Because what I've seen is we should kind of take the test results carefully, because they're not normed for pandemic. So I'm kind of really kind of struggling with that. Like, what do we think is the best way to move forward past COVID? So
I think that's a very good question, and I've not seen anything specific, but I've kind of seen some of the argument play out in a few conferences that we really, over the last year, weren't able to provide the interventions and collect the progress monitoring data on some students we might have been concerned about. And so we can't place based on that, but want to move forward with figuring out what's going on and providing some services to a student if we truly think they have a specific learning disability. And in that case, it would make sense to me that this is a better approach. Now, at the same time, I've been in on a conference that clearly, very clearly in my mind, showed using this method, using cross battery, a pattern of strengths and weaknesses. And in that case, the argument still came up. And in this case, from the parent side, that, yeah, I know you're seeing that, but with COVID and with virtual instruction and with disruptions in instruction and all that kind of stuff, we don't think that that's the reason. We think that it was created by the environmental situation that we were in with COVID. So I think no matter what you use, you have to have that discussion. You have to have that argument. But I see what you mean. Where are you going to get the data from otherwise?
Yeah.
I think there were some schools that were still able to keep their intervention process rolling, and they just did it through, breakout groups and, but it's not the same. I mean, it couldn't be.
Yeah, that's what our district did. And I just don't know if I trust a lot of the data that we got last year.
Yeah.
With those students. I don't know. I just don't feel it was consistently good. So. Okay.
So Adrian, are you using cross battery?
For the most part, we use insufficient progress.
Okay.
We do use cross battery when we feel it's necessary. And that's kind of my question, like, is it necessary going forward, at least for a while, until things get back on track? And then our district is also currently in the process of moving over from using STAR assessments to now we're doing NWEA this school year. So we're not sure if that's going to throw off some of that data that we have. So,
wow. Yeah. And you may have to supplement with other data too, because of the limitations. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, and I think the biggest thing for me, when really looking into this, I mean, years ago, I think you and I worked together years and years ago on doing some training up there.
Yeah.
And it was that there were so many districts around the state that really didn't know, because Article 7 just says another process analyzing the processes or the pattern of strengths and weaknesses, but it doesn't tell you should maybe try this method or this one or this one. It doesn't prescribe any of that. And so there are a lot of districts that are still using severe discrepancy that is masked as pattern of strengths and weakness. I mean, I've seen reports where somebody will write, well, their strength was their IQ score. Their weakness was their reading comprehension score. And that's clearly a pattern for specific learning disability. And it's not what it means at all. I mean, I think it forces us as the professionals to look back on the research and say, I've got to have something that I can identify as, this is how I did it. This is how I approached it. And this is why I'm interpreting it the way I am. So, determine what works best for the test that you're using and for the questions that you have, and follow that method. And refer to it. I mean, you can explain it within your report so that if it ever does come into question, you can say, well, I was using this particular method that's been established in the literature.
Yeah.
What other questions does anyone have? All right. Well, I don't want to keep you for the sake of keeping you. If you guys would go to the evaluation, and I will type it in the chat as well. And it's our standard evaluation, and just look for SLD PSW in the drop down, and reach out to me anytime you have questions. I mean, we've been meeting with our educational diagnostician office hours, but typically 1 or 2 people may come in and ask a question, and that's about it. So please reach out to me if you want to sign up and haven't been able to do so. All right, I'll get this in the chat. There we go. Well, thank you guys for coming. I know it's a busy time. Have a wonderful weekend.